Welcome back. I'm Aisha, your host. Uzma Jalaluddin is a mother, teacher, writer, and author of Aisha at Last, a book that has been recently optioned for film by a major production house. Today, we talk to her about all that she does. Welcome to the show, Uzma.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to talk a little bit on this segment about the journey of you as a writer and the book. So let's start with a little bit about you, Uzma. Tell me a little bit about your childhood, how you grew up, all of that fun stuff.
Well, I grew up in Toronto. I was born and raised here. I grew up in Scarborough, very close to the Muslim community there. My parents are wonderful, very supportive. They knew that I was a reader from a very young age. I would constantly read. They even, would take me to the public library all the time, the Toronto Public Library. Yeah, I mean, there's not much to say. It was a very normal, boring childhood, very stable, happy. My parents and my brother and I lived in Scarborough, and I also lived with an extended family. So I had grandparents living with me at various times, aunts and uncles living with me at various times, because we were immigrants. And when people move to a country, they need some place to stay for a while.
Yeah.
Other than that, I went to Scarborough schools. High schools. I attended the University of Toronto. I actually studied, I guess I'm the kind of person who's interested in a lot of different things. So I studied biology, sociology, and English literature.
Amazing.
I went to Teachers College. I'm a high school teacher now. And I teach science and English.
Very interesting.
I'm married. I have 2 children, 2 sons.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Did you know you always wanted to write? Because you said reading was a big part of your life. Your parents took you to the Toronto Public Library. So obviously that element was sort of, implemented within your life. But what about the writing aspect?
I've always been a reader, and I think all writing really is rooted in reading, and a love of reading, a love of stories, and the way that stories are told. And in terms of writing, I was a writer from a very young age. I wrote small stories, picture books, poems. I kept a diary for decades.
Wow.
All very boring stuff,
yeah.
Looking back on it.
Are you sure?
Oh yeah, definitely. I didn't have much going on. But I think what the key there, like so much of art and so much of craft, is repetition and working on my voice, working on the way that I constructed my sentences, working on my perspective on the world. So in person, I'm a very quiet, shy person, introverted. I know it doesn't appear like that right now, but I am. I'm very internal. So the voice that I worked on throughout all of my stories is one that kind of comes out in Aisha at Last. It comes out in the columns that I write for the Toronto Star, and that's the work of decades. So I started taking writing very seriously in terms of writing a novel after I had my second son. So he's 10 years old now, so I've been on this journey for 10 years. And some people say that, to gain any proficiency in a craft, you need about 10,000 hours. This is a theory of Malcolm Gladwell. 10,000 hours roughly translates to 10 years. And I feel like I've been on this journey probably for 20, but 10 years in earnest.
Did something happen that triggered, like, was it the birth of your son and you were kind of like, okay, now's the time, or was it kind of like?
It was just, I'm a high school teacher, I'm established in my career, I have my children, and this is just something I've always wanted to do. And, life is short, time is now. So, and I knew, talking to another writer friend of mine, Rukhsana Khan, who's a wonderful writer, and she told me that to get published took her about 7 to 8 years. So I thought, okay, I'm going to start now.
Wow.
And let's see, I'm probably going to be slower than her, and it's going to take me a lot longer, and but I need to start. I never had this idea that I'm going to write a story and then someone is going to publish it and it'll be an instant bestseller. I never thought that. I know that to be on this writing journey, I'm in it for the long haul. This is not a sprint, this is a marathon. It's going to take years of work. And I was willing to put in that work, but I wanted to get started then.
So walk us through, I know Aisha at Last took you 8 years to write.
That's right.
So walk us through, take me back to the very first time you sat down at your desk and you were like, this is it. Like, what's the process like?
The process varies by artist. It really does. For me personally, I went through many iterations, and I think that this book and the book that I was working on before this book really taught me how to be a writer. Even though I had read probably thousands of books at that point. And I'm an English teacher, I'm a high school teacher, so I know the process of writing. I definitely talk about books in my class constantly.
Yeah.
But to sit down and actually write is a completely different experience. And some people are very diligent. They write every single day at the same time. My life just does not lend itself to that. I'm a busy mom. I have a large family, and I have multiple responsibilities. So usually my writing time was just stolen moments. I would drop my kids off at swimming class, and I would have 45 minutes to write. So I would sit in a corner and type furiously.
Just anywhere in a corner?
Yep. Sometimes I would go, I remember it with Aisha at Last, and the book that I was working on before, I would drop my eldest son, he was 3 at the time, at preschool, and I would take my newborn to a Second Cup coffee shop and sit down for an hour.
With a newborn?
With a newborn, as it was his nap time. So I would sit down, I would order my treat for the, it was twice a week, so my treat for the day was a coffee from Second Cup, and I would just sit there and furiously type. And sometimes he'd wake up and start crying, and that's it. But it's just the diligence of it. Like, I'm going to do this. This is what I want to do, more than anything else. And it was just not giving up and continuing to work on my craft. And as I started having a draft of a book, I would give it to my friends who were also writers, which is very important because you need feedback from your peers, not just giving it to your mom and her saying, "You're fantastic," is not very helpful. You need honesty. My husband is also incredibly supportive and always gives me his honest feedback, whether I want it or not. And I just developed and grew. I took the feedback, I changed my story, I worked on my storytelling, I read books on writing, and it was a very slow process, but I loved it.
How did you get the idea for Aisha at Last? Like, did it just come to you, or how did that happen?
I always start with characters. So the idea of Aisha at Last began with Khalid. So he just kind of popped into my mind one day, and sometimes this happens and sometimes it doesn't. He popped into my mind one day as a fully fleshed out person. He was just, he's a traditional Muslim man, so he dresses very traditionally as well, very religious. He wears a long white robe, a thobe, kufi and a beard, and he just kind of appeared in my imagination as someone who looks a certain way and immediately causes people to think in terms of stereotypes of the Middle Eastern Arab man, and yet he had so much heart, and I could see inside him almost. I could see the person that he was underneath, the perception, and I needed to tell his story. That's how the book began.
So when you say you get this idea, you start with the characters. So is it Khalid comes to your mind, you sit down, and then you type sort of Khalid as the character, or do you type like sort of does a story come to your mind related to Khalid? Like, how does that work?
So with this particular book, there's 2 ways you can do it. I think I spent a lot of time just thinking about who is Khalid? What does he want? And then the other character, Aisha, came into my mind as well. Who is she? What does she want? How can I make these 2 characters kind of interact? And it turned out to be a love story, a romantic comedy, actually, of all things. And I realized very early on that my voice is a little sarcastic, a little funny. I wanted to write a funny story about Muslims, and these were my 2 characters. So the plot was definitely nothing that was kind of planned out in advance. It just sort of came to me.
As you're writing?
As I was writing.
Like you said, where the characters take you kind
That's
of
right. I would carry around a notebook with me, and any time that I had an idea for plot, I would write down my ideas. And then that was my first draft. So my first draft of this book, I wrote furiously over the course of 3 months. It was just pouring out of me. But it was a very first draft, and oftentimes, and I've learned this as I've grown in my craft as a writer, your first draft is basically the story that you're telling yourself. It has gone through probably 15 drafts since over the course of 8 years, but that first draft took 3 months, and it was just the raw essence of the story. And it's completely changed. The characters have changed, the situation has changed, characters have been killed off and resurrected, and other characters have been brought in. Some people sort of write their stories as if they're driving in the dark. They don't know where they're headed. And that was how the first draft of Aisha at Last was for me. Subsequent drafts were much more organized. I started coming up, because I think it's because I'm a teacher, sort of like a plot graph. I know this is going to happen.
So the other ones, when you say they weren't organized, it was just sort of like, you just poured it all out, and it was just all over the place, and then the other ones you sort of tried to organize it more?
It was always a very chronological plot, but in the sense that once you have a draft, you sort of have to take a step back, take a little bit of breathing room, and look at the entire story as a whole and see where all of your different plot threads, do they all match up? Do they make sense? Do they add to the theme of your book or the themes of your book? Are your characters consistent from the very beginning? Are they behaving one way for the first half of the book and another way that doesn't make sense for who they are in the second half of the book? So that's what I mean.
And then about when it comes to the themes, like how you said, you know, you want to make sure sort of your characters on the flow, it all works together. How does that tie in from a writer's perspective? Like, do the themes come about and then you figure out how to tie it all together, or how does that sort of?
It all happens simultaneously for me. So I have my characters, I know what they want and what they're afraid of, what their deepest fears and deepest longings are, and who they are as characters. And I know the type of story that I want to write. So for this book, I wanted to write a joyful story about Muslims, something that really tackled issues of identity and issues of what does it mean to be part of a community and also to be a part of a society and yet sort of separate from that society at the same time. How does it feel to be part of a family, especially a large extended family like Aisha is, and have the burden of that family and also the beauty of that family? So I knew that those were all of the type of issues that I wanted to tackle, and because that's who my characters were.
Before you even wrote the story, or was this after?
Some of them were before I started writing the story. I knew I wanted to write an entertaining love story about Muslims. And then the other stuff sort of came across as I began writing it and as I started drafting it, and I would take a step back. I had a long time to write the book. It took 8 years. So over the course of those years, I've changed too. So my focus sort of shifted as I started writing. And the deeper I got into the story and the more I worked on the characters and the plot, I realized that certain themes were coming out, and I dug deeper and I made them a little bit more apparent.
While you were writing within these 8 years, did you find, like, were you also relying on a lot of reading as well to continue to sort of, retrain your mind or pick up on different ideas and that kind of thing? Or was it just dedicated, like, I'm writing and that's the focus?
I didn't write this book every single day for 8 years. I would write it for a few months and then life would come and would happen. I had newborns, I had babies. I'm a teacher, so teaching is a job that takes an incredible amount of time. And then I'd work on it for a few months, maybe 6 months, and then I wouldn't touch it for a year.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, there was one point where I didn't touch it for 2 years, and I thought that I was never going to go back, and then something drew me back to it.
I think that's so beautiful that you share such a, like, I don't know what the word is, but like such a raw narrative and like reality, because a lot of people, like, it's hard, right? Like when you're pursuing your passion, but then you have other things you think like you can't do it, like babies and work and stuff like that. But I think that's really, like, it really helps.
Yeah. Well,
people.
I'm like everyone else. I wear a lot of hats. There's a lot of different competing responsibilities, and sometimes this is going to take a back burner because as much as I want to work on it, maybe the story isn't flowing right now, and something else needs my attention right now. I have exams. I need to mark my exams. I have children who need my attention. Yeah. So as much as this was a passion, Stephen King said that art is something that you do that shouldn't just be the focus of your life. Life is life. You should focus on your art in addition to your life.
So I think you've already answered this in many ways, but I'm going to ask you either way. What advice do you have for upcoming writers who are maybe in the process where you are, who've started to write, maybe you want to write but just haven't been able to, and thinking of young people, older people, whatever have you? What's your advice?
Oh God.
$1,000,000 question.
Yes. I get this question a lot, and I think for me, I read a lot of books about writing. I continue to read even as I was writing this book, because my love of reading preceded my love of writing. And I would say if you're really interested in writing, I think it's fantastic, especially if you're a Muslim writer or you're a non-Muslim writer. You need to make sure that you tell your story before someone else comes and tells it for you, especially coming from a marginalized community. Yep. Oftentimes our stories are co-opted by others, and we have our stories being told for us. It's time that we took the reins back and started telling our own stories. It's really important that you understand that writing is an art form, and art takes struggle. It takes work. It's not going to be an easy path. There is no easy way to success. If you want to be successful as a writer, you have to be able to put in the time. And like for me, it wasn't every single day. Sometimes it wasn't even for months at a time. But I was very consistent about wanting to finish a project. The other thing that was really important was seeking feedback that was honest and listening to the feedback, not just immediately becoming defensive about how dare you insult my baby. I'm a brilliant writer. Can you not see my brilliance? So I was always very good at I am very good at taking notes and understanding what people's reactions might be to my book, with the understanding that reading is very subjective.
Yeah.
And then finally, I think it's incredibly important to have a supportive group of people around you. My family is very, very supportive and have always been cheerleaders for my writing journey. I also have a lot of writer friends who I trust, and I can call up when I'm having a good day or a bad day and celebrate my victories and cry over my failures. And failure is a part of writing.
How do you, okay, and I guess one more question, how do you overcome, like, say you're in a situation where you're going through this process and you, like, you know, I've heard where you send out your books and it, like, or your drafts and they get rejected, right?
Constantly,
How do you get over, if people have that fear of failure, how do you overcome that to then have the courage to go back? Because I can imagine if you're taking so long to write like your drafts and they take forever and then they get rejected, like how do you overcome the failure aspect of this? Because it's not easy, right? And it's in some ways it's also an isolated journey in some ways, in terms of like when you're writing and going through that, right?
You're not going to make it as a writer if you can't handle failure. And people handle it in different ways. My novel was rejected multiple times in every step of the process. When I was trying to find an agent, when my agent was trying to find publishers, even before all of that, in its very early stages, dozens of times, most likely. So you have to be okay with it. There's something that's very vulnerable about an artist because you work and you toil in private and you're putting your innermost thoughts onto the page in a way. Even though this is fiction, it's not my story, it's still a part of me. And I'm releasing it into the world and I'm getting rejected. It's incredibly painful. For me, I understand that everything is meant to be. I understand that failure teaches me more lessons probably than success does. And I've learned those lessons and I benefit from them. I call up my friends and I complain like anyone else does. I make a cup of chai and I try to forget it for a couple of days and then I get right back in there.
I think that's very helpful and it's a very honest feedback. So I really appreciate you sharing your story. Thank you so much, Uzma.
No problem.
If you want more of Let the Quran Speak, you can watch previous episodes or new ones by subscribing to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/QuranSpeaks. Stay updated by liking us on Facebook and following us on Twitter @Quran_speaks. And when you're on the go, listen to our podcast at QuranSpeaks.com.